at the time in Vietnam, that's what mechanics did. They basically maintained the helicopter. They weren't. I wasn't assigned any helicopter. I worked on whatever helicopter came into the hangar. So, and like I say, after about 3 months of that, I got bored with it, and you had to volunteer to become a crew member. And if you volunteered to become a crew member, the platoon that needed crew, which they always needed crews, would interview you and decide whether or not you could fly with them. And then, as a 67 November 20, I was assigned a door gunner position, which is an entirely different MOS. I mean, I had been trained on the repairing of the helicopter. I really hadn't been trained. I knew about the M60 machine gun, which was the main armament of the helicopter. I knew about it, but I hadn't really worked with it. So you start as a door gunner, as a crew. And it's a crew of 4. There's a pilot, co-pilot, crew chief, and door gunner. The door gunner is responsible for the weapons on the aircraft. So the two machine guns, the smoke grenades, the frag grenades, the extra weapons that we always carried, M16s, in case we were shot down and needed extra weapons. We had the helicopter I flew as a door gunner had 4 M16s and 2 M60s. So the M60s are the main weapons, and my job at that point was to maintain all those weapons. So if they were fired that night when we got back to base, I'd clean them. The crew chief helped quite a bit. I mean, you know, it really is a team effort. But the door gunner's job was weapons and ammunition and sea rations, because we had to eat when we were out and about. So a typical day for a door gunner started at about 3:30 in the morning and get done about 6 to 9 o'clock at night. And you would do that 7 days a week. I stayed a door gunner for 2 months, and then it's not a promotion, but I moved from door gunner to crew chief. And that's because the crew chiefs that were there at the time were all starting to go home. So there was a constant turnover in the company. There was always new guys starting out that had to be trained, and old guys that were trained that went home. And it was that way. It was that way for the entire Vietnam experience. There were very few units other than their initial deployment that went to Vietnam. It was individuals that went to Vietnam. So the crew chief's job is maintenance of the operational helicopter. So the first thing I did in the morning was crawl around that helicopter and look at bearings, look at seals, oil seals, fuel seals, looking for leaks, making sure that there wasn't anything. I mean, everything had to be what I call tightened up. So I was looking for loose bolts, loose nuts, loose wire, broken wire. When the co-pilot came to the helicopter, he would follow me around and do the same thing I was doing. So we had 4 eyes doing it. Then, if we had a mission, we were going on a mission, he would crank up the helicopter, start the helicopter, and put it in idle, and start looking at making sure that it, first off, that it started. Secondly, that all the fluids and pressures came up, and there were no what we used to call, no loud scary noises. That's what we were looking for, and that's how serious we got about it, because a bearing in the main rotor, I mean, it's just a metal round marble with a hole in it, super strong metal. They could explode, and they did, just from friction, just from heat. So loud scary noises, a lot of times that's what it was a bearing let go, and the helicopter would start to vibrate. So first thing in the morning, that's the crew chief and the co-pilot basically got the helicopter ready to fly. And then all during the day's work, whatever we were doing. My job was to secure loads. I had to make sure that, because we carried water, food, ammunition out to the outposts for the Tiger Division, the Korean Tiger Division. That was the division we supported. So my job was to make sure that the helicopter was loaded right. My job was to make sure that the helicopter was fueled properly, and and in flight monitoring. I was doing the same thing that the aircraft commander was doing, monitoring gauges. Just making sure that they were staying in the normal flight range. So my duty also, quite often, as I think about it now, quite often we would sling loads. The helicopter could carry a big, heavier load outside. So they would literally put it in a sling and take off. And my job at that point was to make sure that the pilot didn't fly the sling into the ground. So, because he couldn't see the load. And I literally would lie down on the floor, hang my head out of the door, and watch the load. So, and talk him down to the ground to unload it. So, I mean, basically what the crew chief did was make sure that the helicopter was properly loaded, safe to fly. And so I just described to you basically most of my flying, and most of everybody's flying, what we called it hash and trash. You hauled hash, you hauled trash, and you brought people here and there. It was just, I mean, it's just like we did when we flew down to Washington. A bunch of people got on the plane and they got them to Washington. About less than 5% of my flight time, we would put people on the helicopter, take everything else off, no seats. They would sit on the floor. They would be fully armed, and we would go and assault, which is the 129th Assault Helicopter Company. That was really our main mission. We would go assault North Vietnamese or Viet Cong units that they had found wherever they found them. So a combat assault, now my job was to make sure that the troops that were sitting on the floor knew what to hang on to, because they weren't strapped in. They were just literally hanging on the floor. They didn't want to be strapped in. To go into a combat assault, you don't want to be on the helicopter. The helicopter is nothing more than a big target, and everybody's shooting at it. So you want out of there as soon as you can get out of there. So my first job was to make sure that they knew where to hang on to, and that was an easy job. My second primary job was the same thing as the door gunner on the right side of the helicopter. I manned the M60 machine gun and shot at anything that I thought was a threat to my helicopter. So combat assaults, very serious, very scary, and thankfully, I always say, few and far between. But Vietnam was a very boring time for most of the time. It was very routine. I mean, hash and trash. I'm not, that's mostly what I did. Mostly what most of us did. But there was that 10% of pure terror of, I'm not coming out of this. And 10% of the time, seeing other helicopters that didn't come out of it, that went into the LZ and stayed in the LZ as a burning wreck. Sometimes the crew got out, sometimes they didn't. I mean, that's what combat assault is. That's what combat is. And you realize early on, particularly in helicopters, that it's all luck. You're either lucky that day or you're not lucky that day. As I said, we supported the Korean Tiger Division, and one of our jobs was to transport the Tiger Division commander wherever he wanted to go, whenever he wanted to go. So we had a helicopter designated, as we called it, and its call sign was Tiger Wagon. And it was a designated helicopter. That's all that helicopter did, was fly the Korean general around wherever he wanted to go, whenever he wanted to go. Senior crew chiefs, after you'd been in country for 8 months, could get in line, could get nominated to be on the Tiger Wagon. And if they accepted you, then you flew Tiger Wagon, and that took you out of combat. My last month and a half in country, I was the Tiger Wagon for the Korean general, and David and I spent a good month and a half just enjoying ourselves, because the general never went on a combat assault. He just went to go yell at his troops. So we got to fly with him, and at one point in time, Tiger Wagon transported Miss Korea around to the Korean units for the Tiger Division, and I got to sit next to Miss Korea. Well, I was in the crew chief slot, but she was sitting in the jump seat in the front. Anytime the real saying is, anytime you're within sight of the enemy, it's a close call. Okay, so the helicopter, the firing, I mean, what I saw, what you see as a crew chief and a helicopter, remember, it's moving. You know, when we're going in fast and hot. So everything that you see out close is blurry. So the close calls I remember were the big green dots that were coming at my helicopter, which the North Vietnamese use green tracers. And they look like a softball. And they weren't, but they look like it. I mean, you know, and they all look like the ones that, they always, all of them, and everybody said the same thing. They were all headed for me. They weren't going to the other helicopters. They were all headed for me, which wasn't true. It was just, that's what it looked like. So the close calls I had there was those green tracers going to the front of the helicopter, or just over behind me to the tail of the helicopter, which is where most of the rounds hit, was in the tail. So you'd get back from flying, you would hear ting 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 ting. You get back, you'd land, and you'd look at the tail of the helicopter, and you'd see 3 or 4, you know, punches in the tail. That's as close as I got. There was, like I say, I was very lucky. The combat assaults I went on, generally the first wave was hot, so they were shooting, we were shooting. But by the second wave, at that time, they didn't really want to engage. They didn't really stand and fight. So they'd let you know they were there, and then they would melt away. And they didn't want to deal with the Koreans. The Koreans were very, very tough fighters. They didn't want to fight the Koreans. Can you imagine not having a cell phone? There were no cell phones. I got to call home twice while I was in Vietnam, and I had to go to Cam Ranh Bay, which was a 2-hour flight away from the base, to do that. And I got to talk on the phone for 5 minutes each time. So it's hard to imagine, and particularly the younger generation, which has access to everything all the time. When we weren't working, we had very little to do. There was AM radio that the Armed Forces Network put on, so we could listen to music. And we would get dance groups from all around the Far East. We had Korean bands, we had Australian bands that would come somewhere in the areas, and so there was entertainment, but it wasn't instantaneous. It was you had to, I'm off on a Saturday now, and there's a band down at the club, so let's go listen to the band. If there wasn't a band at the club and the club was closed, the club was closed. We did a lot of barbecuing. We had barbecues. So our entertainment was I always say, we did our own thing. So you bond, you know people. David Stamper was from West by God, Virginia, and he would tell you that every time. He was very proud of his state. He was married. He had a baby girl, and he was in the Army because he didn't want to be in the coal fields of West by God, Virginia. He literally, he told me several times, he says, I'm getting out of, I love West by God, Virginia, but I don't love working in West by God, Virginia. His intent was to be a career aviation, in aviation for 20 years in the Army. And he died in Vietnam in a combat assault because it was not his day to be flying. And he did fly. And, it's like, I feel, when I think about David, for a long time, I took responsibility for his death because I wasn't there to protect him. And it took me a long time to realize that that wasn't my job. And I did the same things he did. And like I say, I finally came to realize that it wasn't his time to fly that day, but yet he did. So I've come to terms with it. But yet I think about him. I think about him every day.